In 1902, Britain ended a decades-long period known as Splendid Isolation when it entered into an alliance with Japan. Instead of forging an alliance with a European power, Britain sought assistance from Japan to protect their overseas possessions in Asia. Similarly, Russia and France had concluded an alliance in 1894. This is important to remember because in 1904, war had broken out between Russia and Japan, and the threat of a regional war turning global was strikingly present. In October of 1904, Russia and Britain narrowly dodged war after Russian warships mistakenly fired upon British civilian ships. By the 1890s, both the Japanese and Russian empires would have a fervent interest in expanding into East Asia, and it was only natural that the two would develop a bitter rivalry in the region. Both had waged war against the crumbling Qing dynasty of China, eager to seize more land than the other. Ultimately, conflict would break out in 1904 when the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet in Port Arthur. At first, Europeans had unanimously expected an overwhelming Russian victory within a few weeks, but the Russians had underestimated their Japanese foes, and Port Arthur lay besieged by Japanese land and naval forces. The Russians decided that action needed to be taken to crush the Japanese Navy and relieve Port Arthur. Aside from notoriously outdated and unreliable warships, the largest problem plaguing the Russian Navy was a lack of coordination. Russian ships were dispersed across the vast nation's waters and could not be used together. Russian naval officers devised a radical plan to send the Baltic Fleet on an 18,000-mile journey to relieve their navy in Asia. On October 15th, the Baltic Fleet left port under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, and the journey was doomed from the start. Russia had no colonial outposts along the coast of Africa or Asia, and exhaustion would haunt them. Moreover, the Baltic Fleet was trapped in port for most of the year due to the freezing of the Baltic Sea, and Russian sailors were undertrained and had low morale. In previous months, the Russian government had invested thousands of rubles into surveillance of the Baltic Sea to locate a supposed Japanese force. Sailors feared Japanese torpedo boats, a new naval technology that could be used to ambush warships many times larger. The Russian fleet had planned to go through the Danish belts, the North Sea, and the English Channel to reach the Atlantic Ocean. Among the sailors, there were unfounded fears that the Japanese were stationing torpedo boats in friendly British ports, which they would use to ambush them. It is no surprise as to why they hosted these fears, because Japanese torpedo boats had been used to great effect in the Asian theater of the war. Ridiculous fears of a Japanese minefield and reported sightings of Japanese vessels near Denmark only added to the Russian anxiety. The prelude to the Dogger Bank incident occurred on the night of October 21st and 22nd, in which the Russian repair ship Kamchatka reported the presence of numerous Japanese torpedo boats. In reality, they were Swedish fishing vessels, and Russian paranoia increased. That same night, the Baltic Fleet entered the Dogger Bank, an immensely popular fishing location 100 miles off the coast of Britain. The Dogger Bank incident that was to follow was not the first incident between Russia and Britain in 1904. In fact, the Russians had sunk a British ship and commandeered another on two separate occasions, erroneously believing them to be carrying weapons to Japan. These two incidents were resolved diplomatically, and Russia had agreed to never again attack a British ship. So when the Dogger Bank incident occurred, the British public and press reacted with outrage and called for war. On the night of October 21st and 22nd, roughly 50 British fishing trawlers were in the Dogger Bank, all with proper light signals indicating that they were fishing boats. Russian commanders were well aware that fishing vessels were often present in this region of the North Sea, but anxiety had overcome them. The Russian fleet strayed directly into the group of trawlers, and it was standard procedure for the fishermen to fire flares into the night sky to notify the Russians of their location. But paranoid Russian sailors, fearful that torpedo boats were among the trawlers, misinterpreted the flares as the beginning of a Japanese attack. Given that many Russian sailors were inexperienced and poorly trained, it is not surprising why they made the rash decision to immediately open fire, especially considering that it was a particularly foggy night. The Russian warships fired hundreds of shells, with most of the shells missing. In the chaos, a group of Russian cruisers mistook their battleships as Japanese and opened fire. Consequently, the Russian battleships fired back, damaging the cruiser Aurora. The Aurora used its signal light to signal that it was a friendly ship, and the friendly fire subdued. On the battleship Borodino, the hysteria among the crew was so vigorous that they believed that they were being boarded by Japanese soldiers. The 1904 Battle of Dogger Bank lasted 15 minutes, and ended after Admiral Russo-Japanese, believing his non-existent enemy to be fleeing, ordered an end to the firing. The Dogger Bank incident was incredibly ignominious for the Russians. They failed to recognize the harmless nature of the fishing boats and had fired upon their own ships. The quality of the Russian warships was revealed to be miserable. The battleship Oriole fired over 500 shells but did not land a hit. All told, one British trawler had been sunk and numerous others had sustained moderate damage. 2 fishermen had been killed and another 6 were wounded. Caught in the crossfire, 2 Russians had been killed and 1 was wounded. Fearing another Japanese attack, the Russian warships fled the scene. Under strict radio silence, they only informed St. Petersburg what had happened when they docked in Vigo, Spain, 4 days later. At the same time, the British Royal Navy was ordered to trail the Baltic Fleet. British and Russian officials opened discourse to calm the situation. Most government officials on both sides remained level-headed, knowing that war was not in their interests. Russia was struggling enough with Japan, and Britain did not want to find itself in a vulnerable state of war. Still, some radicals in Britain called for war and perceived the incident as an opportunity to crush their Russian rivals. The British presented 3 demands to the Russians in response to the incident, as follows: that Russia apologize for their unlawful attack, that Russia pay full reparations to the injured parties, and that an investigation be opened to determine and punish whoever was responsible for the incident. At first, the Russians maintained that the blame of the incident lay on the British or Japanese, and not at all on the Russians. They believed that British trawlers had conspired with the Japanese to launch a surprise attack. Fearing an escalated conflict, however, the Russians soon relented and accepted the British demands. To appease the British, and well aware of the Royal Navy's presence off the coast of northern Spain, Admiral Russo-Japanese ejected the officers deemed responsible for the incident from their ships while docked in Vigo. Russia and Britain agreed to the establishment of an international commission that would investigate the incident and resolve any disputes. Ultimately, after a meeting in January and February of 1905, the Russians were deemed responsible for the incident, but were cleared of any punishment because their actions were considered to be understandable given the situation. Admiral Russo-Japanese did everything he could to stop the firing once their targets had been identified as fishing trawlers. Although not required, Russia voluntarily paid a sum equal to $10 million in reparations to the affected fishermen and their families. It wasn't just Britain and Russia that were affected by the incident, though. France worked hard to mediate a settlement, and Germany sought to improve relations with Russia. France felt obligated to back Russia, but it also did not want to lose favor with the British. The incident was a trivial matter to the French, and they did not want to see fighting between their allies when Germany was a much larger threat at the time. During the international uncertainty that followed the Dogger Bank incident, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany capitalized on the situation by improving relations with the Russians. Britain was a major rival of Germany's, especially when it came to naval strength. He offered an alliance to the Russians, but they rejected it because they knew France, who they had defensive obligations to, would not approve. The peace settlement that followed the Dogger Bank incident strengthened the friendship between Britain and France and Russia. It was a major milestone in international arbitration and proved that disputes could be solved diplomatically. Nevertheless, the system of alliances that threatened to turn the Russo-Japanese War into a global one was still in place in 1914 and was a major ingredient in the development of World War I.